So welcome to the Riversun Source Block, and we're going to take you on a tour through 40 years of importation of grapevine varieties and clones. Starting first with the Chardonnay selections, but just before we do that, there's a couple of things you need to bear in mind. If you look down the row, you'll see we're on 3.5 metre wide spacings and 3.5 metre high canopy. And essentially that's because here we are growing propagation material for our nursery business. However, in the first 3 bays of every row, we are holding fruit so we can compare clones and, across the season. So that's the first thing. Second one is everything in here is ungrafted. It's important to realise there are over 80 viruses of grapevines around the world. In New Zealand we know of about 20. Every time you introduce a virus into a clone, there is a chance of significantly or subtly changing the clonal properties. So to avoid that risk, everything in here is not grafted. And the third point is that they're growing on classical Gisborne alluvial soils, very deep and very fertile. We're talking 10 metres of pure silt. So if you bear all those things in mind, and the last one is we are in organics transition, so a lot of copper sulphur sprays and biologicals, seaweed products. So if you see any deposits on the berries, that explains it. So, okay, now let's move down the road. The first one we're going to look at is Chardonnay Clone 6. So just before we start looking at Chardonnay Clone 6, I do just want to cover off 3 other importations. So as part of the 40-year history, the first properly documented importation was Chardonnay Mendoza, bought back in the early 1970s from CSIRO in Western Australia. So Chardonnay Mendoza, it's not in this block. The reason for that is it's well known by everyone in the industry that it's infected with leaf roll type 1. And as I explained, we worked very hard to make sure this is a very clean block from a virus perspective. So that's why we don't have it planted. Having said that, it's a very good, a very highly regarded clone, even to this day, and is quite widely planted. Typical characteristics of Chardonnay Mendoza: a lot of hen and chickens, big and small berries, moderate yielder, and makes very good quality wine. So a lot of winemakers love it. We will talk a little bit more through this tour about that as we compare other clones. 2 other clones, also not in this block, were importations from University of California in Davis, clones 4 and 5. They came in again in the 1970s, I think it was. Now, we're quite widely planted in this region, well known for having very big bunches, big berries, and very productive, but as a result very susceptible to botrytis. So they fell out of favour during the 80s and early 90s and were soon replaced by Chardonnay Clone 6. Now I'd like to introduce you to my good friend and colleague Nick Hoskins. Nick is a highly respected viticulturalist, has his own consultancy business and vineyard management company. Riversun's been a very long-term client of Nick's, and through the whole journey of importation, clonal selection, certification program development, we've worked very closely on that since the mid-80s. So Nick, can you talk to us please about what you're seeing on Chardonnay Clone 6?
Sure, Jeff. Yep. Just before we start, Jeff's already mentioned the UC Davis clones, which 4 and 5. They were all selected in those early days for productivity, and I think 6 is also very productive. Nowadays people are selecting clones for lower productivity and better flavours, so that's just the starting point. So this clone 6 here, and you can see tight bunches. There's not a lot of elasticity in there, and that's a problem for botrytis, which we'll have a look for in a minute. Again, another bunch here, very tight, not a lot of movement there, and some of these berries are starting to be squeezed off. I have to say I have seen it, Chardonnay Clone 6, more productive and tighter in Gisborne. This year's actually quite good. So if we come down the row, we'll hopefully, or not, see some botrytis. Yeah, here's a bunch here that's so tight that one of those berries I showed you before is pushed off, and it's allowed the chance for botrytis to start developing in that bunch. Not too bad at this stage, but it's early days. We're probably only, around 18 bricks on this, I think.
So Nick, tell me what you're tasting on the Chardonnay Clone 6. I know it's fairly early in the season still, but...
Yes, very early in the season, but for me the Clone 6 has more of those green apple flavours at this point, and it can produce high quality still wines, but generally a lot of it's used for bubbly base, some of it's used for lower tier wines, and most winemakers would prefer to use other clones in terms of flavour for their premium quality wines.
Another point to make, this is 2012 vintage. We have had in Gisborne and throughout New Zealand a very challenging autumn and summer. So in Gisborne here we've had rain on 20 of the last 30 days. It's been very cool, a lot of leaf wetness. So it's important to bear that in mind when looking at all the different clones in terms, it's a great year to test their propensity for botrytis, or their sensitivity to botrytis. So with that, let's now go and shoot across and have a look at Chardonnay 15 in the next row. Okay, so here we are with Chardonnay 15. As I said a few minutes ago, it can be a little inconsistent cropping. Last year we had a fairly light crop on the Clone 15 in Gisborne, or certainly in this block, so it's bounced back quite strongly this year. So this is a good example of 15 in a big year. So it's actually cropping more heavily this year than the Chardonnay Clone 6. However, the bunch structure, the berry size is probably is typical of what we see year in, year out. Nick, you got any comments you'd like to make about that?
Yeah, for me, Chardonnay 15 is more like this and like this we see here with a lot of these little berries. So you can see the bunch structure is much looser than the 6 we were looking at before. Bit of powdery mildew there.
Thanks, Nick.
And quite often the bunches are smaller in weight as well. So, and as Jeff says, you can get that variable flowering, which sometimes in Martinborough South you get a very poor set because of that. So 15 is not preferred clone because of that. It's more like Mendoza in terms of fruit set, can be quite low production. So in Gisborne though, quite good production here, probably a very good set this year. In terms of tasting, perhaps slightly riper than the Clone 6, still quite green at this point. It is a clone that winemakers prefer, and there's a fair portion of Clone 15 used in some of the premium quality Chardonnay still wines.
Having said that, we're going through this walkthrough history, so we started off saying about 4 and 5 very productive clones. They kind of went out of favour. Clone 6 replaced it. 15 in the, I'm thinking, Nick, it must have been the early 90s when 15 first really came to the market.
1985, I think.
It was imported in 85 by Alan Clark on behalf of the New Zealand Vine Improvement Group, but didn't really get to the market and start getting interest till the early 90s.
Richard Smart.
Richard Smart, sorry.
Yep.
Okay. So what we saw as a nursery was a lot of interest in Chardonnay 15 in the mid to late 90s. And then we're going to take you to have a look now at the first of the Burgundy selections, Chardonnay Clone 95. So let's go and have a look at that, and that has currently, today, is probably the most preferred clone. So in 1988, Alan Clark, on behalf of the New Zealand Vine Improvement Group, imported 2 clones from Burgundy, and they were what we call B95 and B96. So here we are looking at Chardonnay 95. As I said just a minute ago, it has become probably the mainstay clone in the last 10 years of plantings. Now what we typically see, quite a conical bunch and quite tight, as a result, reasonably quite prone to botrytis. So Nick, tell me what you're seeing here, man.
Yes, I agree. Again, tight bunches on this 95. This is a typical bunch shape with an elongated bunch, a little bit of a shoulder either side. Pretty tight, in this case as tight as the Clone 6. If we're looking a little bit further down here, I think we're starting to see the beginnings of some rot in these bunches due to the tightness of those, and good productivity. Again, B95 as it's called. The B stands for Bernard, who it was imported directly from Raymond Bernard, not from the Ontave collection, and so hence the B95. When Jeff and Rod and I visited Burgundy in 2007, it was, we specifically went to look at this clonal material, and the guys from Ontave had set up a few vineyards for us to look at in Cordon Charlemagne, the premium Chardonnay producing region of Burgundy. And when we questioned growers there, a lot of them used Chardonnay in their vineyards that was called Massal selection or selection Massal, which means they had taken material from their vineyards, propagated themselves and planted it, and grew that in their vineyards for Grand Cru wine production. So that was at about they typically had maybe 40% of selection Massal in their vineyard, and then a lot of them had started to move on to the Ontave clones. So the earlier clones were 75 and 76, then 95 and 96, so 95 was preferred by them. And more recently they'd started to use some of the newer Ontave selections, which we'll show you soon, which is 548, 809 and the 1066. So we saw a lot of Chardonnay clones there, and tasted a lot of wines from those clonal mixes. As far as I'm concerned, 95 makes really good wine, and many of the producers producing premium quality Chardonnay like it. And next to Mendoza, it's probably the second most preferred clone at the moment.
Does it set as heavily as tight? Are the bunches as tight further south, where you've got cooler climate for cooler flowering conditions?
A good point, and I think something to be remembered is that when we're looking at Chardonnay clones for Gisborne and Chardonnay clones for Hawke's Bay, as opposed to Chardonnay clones further south, quite often where flowering is poor further south, we're looking for better productivity. And we wouldn't get bunches of 95 as big as this, say, in Martinborough or in Central Otago. So it's a good point, thanks to Rose, Jeff.
Just the other one, Nick talked about the mass selection, or selection Massal as they call it in France. Basically what that means is this is a clone. It has been selected from one vine in Burgundy and has been multiplied from that. Whereas Massal selection is going into a vineyard and selecting cuttings from a range of plants which to the vigneron they see as having superior qualities. But you have a quite a wide gene pool, I guess, in there. Whereas here you are down to one clone. And there's quite a debate in Burgundy. Some people are very strongly favour the Massal selection. Others really see that, the value of clonal selection. And one of the big advantages of clonal selection is you do know what you're getting, and you're going to get it every time, but also you know the health status, particularly the virus status of that material. Whereas under Massal selection, there is always the risk of introducing a range of viruses into your vineyard. And as we all know in New Zealand, with the spread of leaf roll 3, introducing virus into your vineyard is not something any of us sort of willingly go out and do. We're just going to roll back about 20 years in importation history to 1978, when Frank Berry-Smith imported a clone of Chardonnay from Switzerland, from Lucerne. It's called Chardonnay 2-23. I recall when it sort of first hit the market in the mid to late 80s, there was quite a lot of interest in it. It was around about the same time as Chardonnay Clone 6. It was soon superseded by the likes of Clone 15 and 95. Now, Nick, you've had a bit of experience working with Chardonnay 2-23. Can you tell us about that and what you're seeing here?
Yes, when I was working at Martinborough Vineyard, we grew 2-23, Clone 6 and Clone 15 in our Chardonnay block down there. The 2-23 wine was always preferred over the Clone 6, and on roughly on a par with the Clone 15. So, however, the 2-bar 23 that I was looking at in Martinborough wasn't quite as productive as what you see here
This
today.
wall of fruit.
Yes, this is really very big bunches, bigger than the Clone 6 and bigger than the 95. And having said that, though, I don't see any rot in here. So I think the maybe the skins are tougher, or because the bunches are very tight, but they haven't seemed to push off and haven't seemed to got any botrytis, which is kind of what we saw in Martinborough as well.
And that's certainly something I've noticed in the 5 years it's been planted here, that we've been seeing fruit. It's every year it's held up very well. So yep, went. It hasn't been planted. I don't know when we last grafted 2-bar 23, but we just thought we'd just show you this just as a matter of interest, just to help to complete that history. So now we'd like to move down and start looking at the new Ontave selections, which we started importing back in 2003. Welcome to the first of our Chardonnay clones, which we've imported from Ontave in France. And before Nick and I have a look at those, I'd just like to tell you a little of the story about Ontave, who they are, how they came to be, and how Riversun, our connection with them as sole licensee for all the Ontave selections now in New Zealand. Following the Second World War, there was quite a exodus from a lot of the vineyards, and the French government was very concerned that they were going to start losing a lot of their genetic history after a millennia of selection amongst all the regions. A lot of this material had been compromised with virus infection, and a lot of the namings, sometimes there were 50 names in different regions for the same variety. So Ontave's job was to go out, scour the country, collect this material, put it through a sanitation program to remove the worst viruses, and select and come up with clonal selections which were typical of variety, high health, and productive. And I mentioned earlier on how you'll see over 40 years of clonal selection the change from big bunches, big berries, tight bunches, through to the most recent selections where you've got quite the opposite: small berries, small bunches, loose. So Riversun, we set ourselves the goal in 1998 of producing the highest quality grafted grapevines in the world and be able to prove it. And we knew to do that we had to become a licensee for Ontave. So we started negotiations in 1999 for that. We were signed up in 2002, and from 2003 onwards we've now imported over 50 Ontave clones and varieties. So now let's have a look at the Chardonnay 121. So I'll hand over to you, Nick, if you want to talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing here.
Okay, so Chardonnay 121 firstly was selected in Champagne, so it is used for producing champagne or sparkling wine. Also a lot of it all planted in Burgundy for still wine as well, so a multi-purpose variety. Clone, again, smaller berries I think than Clone 6 or 2-bar 23, still quite tight bunches. You can see here that's fairly tight, whereas a little bit looser on that one. And this is kind of your typical bunch here. It does seem to have quite tough skins like the 2-bar 23, and I think the thing about the 121 is the intense and bright citrusy flavours that it delivers, and I think that's an important part of sparkling wine, why it makes good sparkling wine. But depending on the style of Chardonnay, it can add something to the premium still wines as well.
My only other comment to add to that would be it's actually held up pretty well if you compare it with 95. I think generally we see a bit more disease pressure in 95 with botrytis. 121 always seems to hold up a bit better, but when you compare it to the next clone we're going to look at, certainly it's still vulnerable to the botrytis. Yeah. So now let's just go and have a look at the next row, which is Chardonnay 548. Now that one has really set the world on fire. Let's have a look at it. So Chardonnay 548 was actually selected back in the late 70s. So it's been around a while in France, but only arrived, came out of our quarantine in 2005. And the very first year that we had any fruit on here was 07, and we did a microvinification across all the Ontave imports. And from the very first microvin, people started getting pretty excited what they were tasting. And since then, we've basically sold out every year. And as quickly as we can plant more and bring it into production, as Messiah would block, the orders are rolling out in front of us. So what are they liking about it? It seems to be a moderate cropper. It's not a heavily productive clone. It's moderate cropping, moderate sized bunches, reasonably open bunches, fairly consistent, not too much hen and chicken in there, but it seems to have a thicker skin, and as a result, all of those things, it seems very botrytis tolerant. So over the last 5 years, it's always stood up very well. The row next door, 121, might be crashing badly. This is still looking very clean. Nick, you've been tasting the fruit on these over the years, and do you want to talk to us about what you're seeing and what the winemakers' comments are about the flavours in the fruit?
Yes, we've had a lot of winemakers come and look at this and get very excited about it, and excited from a flavour point of view. And I think, as Jeff's just said, the bunches are quite a bit shorter, more compact. That's perhaps a little bit longer one there, but they're very loose. There's a lot of elasticity in there. There's room for those berries to expand within that bunch. So as Jeff said, a little less problems with botrytis and any other rots. Seems to have quite a thick skin, and the flavours are very, very pronounced, and we get good citrus flavours, nice tropical banana-y type flavours, and I think it lends itself to winemaking. And as Jeff said, the microvins we made, many of the winemakers just, man, if you gave this fruit some oak, it would be fantastic. And I think that to me was really saying something about the quality of this. So I look at it as better than Chardonnay Mendoza and better than Chardonnay 95, and I think that's what we're seeing out in the field. We're looking forward to some commercial wines of this coming out as well. So,
and in terms of other comments from the winemakers and just what we're seeing with, it seems to flower just a few days earlier than the likes of Chardonnay 6. It ripens up a little bit earlier. It has the highest sugar levels of all of the Ontave clones, if you look through their catalogue. So all of those things augur very well for it, and great flavours. And the comments, the consistent comment we get is right through that ripening, even though it's the Brix comes up and it's got great sugar loading in it. It's got a really nice nice acid balance in there, and it retains that acidity right through the ripening, and that's what's coming through in the wine. So great flavours, good acid, sugar balance. Like I say, people are excited to the point where every year so far we can't graft enough of it.
Exactly.
On that note, and it's interesting, it's a point well worth making, we can't just go and produce more budwood overnight. As I said, everything in here is on its own roots. Everything in here is totally traceable back to the original vine in France, in Ontave, where they supplied it, and they can trace it right back through France, through their original selection program. It's only with Ontave clones are the only material, and anything Riversun has brought in from overseas, where we can do that. And that allows us to certify to the clone. So everything else we've talked about, all the Chardonnay, Clone 6, Chardonnay 95, Clone 15, they're called clones, but in fact we have no traceability, and we have no way of proving they are in fact those clones. Everything that Riversun has brought in since 2003, we've re-established that provenance or maintain that provenance from the country of origin right through to these vines. So that's through quarantine, through rapid multiplication, through planting. So that's a really important point for people to understand. So when the demand for 548 explodes in front of us, I can't just go to a client's vines which we have grafted and they've planted in their vineyard and harvest that wood. Firstly, we've lost traceability the day that we hand it to them. If they have planted and mixed up, we don't know. And also they are grafted, so there's the risk of minor viruses being introduced through that grafting process. Like I say, they're minor, and they can make ever such subtle differences to the clonal properties and the flavours. So that's Chardonnay 548. The next one we'd like to look at is Chardonnay 809, which is a really interesting Chardonnay. Most people, when they taste it, certainly when they taste the wine, if it's made purely from that clone, would swear it's not a Chardonnay. Let's go and have a look at it and a bit of a taste on it and explain why we sometimes get that reaction. So here we are in Chardonnay 809. It's a more recent Ontave selection. and a pretty interesting one at that. Nick, what can you tell us about Chardonnay Musc, as the French call it?
Yeah, well, Chardonnay Musc, or muscat Chardonnay, it's because it's got a muscat flavour. Really easy to taste when you eat the berries. It's used mainly as a blending component in Grand Cru wines from areas such as Court and Charlemagne, probably at a level of about 5%. And I have tried some wines in California that were made solely from Chardonnay 809. Very interesting, a different style, perhaps more a younger person's wine with quite a strong muscat flavour. On the vine, the bunches here are a little bit variable, quite productive, and you can see some bunches are quite tight. This one here, quite a bit looser, different sort of sizes. So you can see that a little bit variable, can be quite tight. It's holding up well, and seems to. You'll certainly notice the flavour when you eat one of these berries. Quite distinctive in the field, quite distinctive in the wine. Some early microvins that we made here, very distinct wine, and and commented on by a lot of winemakers as being very suitable to add as a proportion of their still wines.
We've had a number of winemakers comment they see 809 as having a really important part to play with unoaked Chardonnays, just having that little muscat flavour through there, giving it something a little bit distinctive. Some unoaked Chardonnays can be a little bit flat or bland, so they see this has a real place for them in that. Okay, so that's the end of the tour, the virtual tour through 40 years of clonal importation. We think it's a pretty fascinating story and hope you enjoyed it.